Okay, this is the last lecture for this semester for you, Untitled. Asked to try to introduce you to this great work that's in 3 different sections in one 45-minute session. But I shall do my best. He's going to take you through hell. That's what hell looks like in somebody's imagination. A state of despair, stagnation, absolute isolation, up to purgatory, preparation for heaven, purification, cleansing, return to innocence, all as, of course, imagined in the imagination of the poet Dante. Bliss, total fulfillment. So this is the journey of the work, and it comes in 3 parts: the Inferno, the Purgatorio, and the Paradiso. And I shall try to do my best to introduce you to it as much as I can. All right, this was a video that's not going to be playing of how much this lion loved this man, this person who rescued the lion, etc. But I can't show it to you. But yeah, this work revolves around the notion of love. And of course, love means so many, many different things. There's this natural love, instinctive love, and in this video, which I isn't prepared to be shown to you, this woman had rescued this lion cub and raised it, and then put it in a zoo. And many, many years later, she came back to see if that lion was still okay. And as soon as the lion saw her, he jumped up and started to caress her and try to love her. So love can be sort of an instinctive response to someone that's been good to us, or something attractive, or something like that. But love has many, many different meanings, and unfortunately, probably you haven't even started to talk about that topic, although it's introduced earlier in this semester in other people, but you haven't had it. So today, in this lecture, that's why I had flashed this other thing here at the end, at the beginning, rather than the end, is the 7. Any of you saw a movie called 7 recently? I guess it's a little bit, it was about 5, 6, 7 years ago. 7, based on the so-called the 7 basic sins, the 7 cardinal sins. All right, now the movie is a movie, a very fine movie, but it doesn't really have much to do with the heart of what's happening here. But 7, Dante, and of course the theologians before him in this period, had kind of summarized human evil and human goodness in 7 categories, all right? And all of them are forms of love. So you see how love can mean something much, much more than just what you are attracted to, or what just you want to possess. Or love, of course, is in this Abrahamic monotheistic tradition. Love is the going out of yourself to do for others and guarantee for others everything that you want for yourself. Loving your neighbor, meaning any human, the same way you love yourself. So we start off with loving ourselves, and this self-love can grow and become purified in Plato's view of eros. It can start to be loving not just food and drink and sex and things like this, but this love can grow and become the love of more important things, and the love of finding the love of beauty, the love of intellectual things, and the love of beauty. So that's a much more refined kind of love. So that's another sort of love. So there's the instinctive love, there's the love that grows with the growth of reason, the growth of experience, into love, seeking to love that which is higher and better and more glorious and more beautiful and more true and more good and all of that. Now, the Abrahamic love that comes out of the monotheistic scriptures adds the word agape to eros. Eros and agape were the two words that were used for love Eros was the main one. Agape was rarely used in the Greek language because the Christian scriptures were written primarily in Greek, into Greek, because Greek was the language of the Roman Empire. So they chose to try to put into agape what they claim to have been experiencing now of divine love, God's love. When you experience God's love, you experience as something almost qualitatively different from all the other kinds of love. And so, by Dante's time, already with Augustine, but we didn't do that when we were doing Augustine, but it became, the understanding was that the fullness of love, now in the Latin language, was caritas. And that's what Dante's trying to show through his whole poetic work, love. And what is love, and what are the degrees of love, and what does love do, and how love can go in the right direction, how love can go in the wrong direction. It's not just love. See, the Epicureans have said love is whatever kind of love, as long as it's love, is quite all right. So there was this philosophical give and take back and forth. No, it's not just love, it's not just love, you know. You have to see the quality of the love, the type of love, what's happening, where's it going, what's it doing. It isn't that simple when you just talk about love. You know, make love, not war, or something like that. So, caritas is primarily understood to be what happens to a human being who's developing his eros in the Platonic way, if you like, letting your attraction, love, be towards more and more important things, the hierarchy that Plato had put and that the Greeks had put there. Loving higher things more than lower things, developing your love. But however, God's love is not your love for God, because a human can never love God the way God loves the human. This is, of course, the dividing line of monotheistic thinking with many other forms of thinking, other philosophies you'll deal with, and other mysticisms and things like that. This is the love that God initiates. So God initiates the relationship between yourself and Him. He comes to you, He gives you things, and your faith, the Abrahamic faith, is to respond the way Abraham did. Having experienced as God, he tries to respond to Him in the best way he knows how to. So faith becomes the best kind of response to the experience of this God's love. So in this Christian world, of course, the coming of the Christ was supposedly the experience, now God with, is the Emmanuel, is God with the human. So humans now are experiencing God through this and with this person, Jesus of Nazareth. And so now experiencing this kind of love, they see, number one, that it can't be reached. You can't reach it through anything you're doing. It has to be accepted. So the first thing of faith is the humility of recognizing you can never reach God's love. He reaches out to you, He is reaching out to you, and you develop your eros, your love, in a more rational and a more good way, and then you will experience, and as you experience God's love, it purifies your own human love. So caritas, love, the highest form of love in Dante, is agape fulfilling eros. So it's not against eros, it's not grace against nature, as the theologians put it. It's grace fulfilling nature, bringing out of nature nature and causing it to purify all the things that have become stuck to eros being improperly used. Eros leading to pride, or eros mistaking the direction and thinking something is God when it's not God. Absolutizing the relative is called in philosophy. Eros can go wrong. Eros can reach to pride. The philosopher, for instance, this doesn't mean philosophers are like that, but the image of the ancient philosopher, the philosopher might think he's superior to everybody else just because he's a philosopher. And so Aristotle can draw the right conclusion that basically, why should any soul be immortal other than the philosopher's rational soul? It just disappears. So there's sort of an almost impossible way to fight pride if you just take the way of a human being developing himself fully. So the basic claim of monotheism is that this is the disease of humanity from the time of Adam and Eve, when they wanted to be their own gods and they didn't just want to respond in the best way to what God had given them. So Adam betrays Eve, and then Cain kills Abel, and then the whole 1 to 11 story is that of one of increasing and developing evil as a result of pride. So pride is always in sin And sin supposedly not just error or mistake or hubris or hamartia or anything else, but sin in this monotheistic way it's being interpreted is primarily you have something, you have power, you have freedom, and you abuse it. You use it only for your own sake, against everything else, against other humans and that. So this is the heart of what is being presented to you now, because the title of this lecture is supposedly Christian Thought Expressed Through Poetry. So if you take a look at the fly sheet, Christian thought. So in this semester we've been dealing with different philosophers. We started off with Plato and Plotinus, and then we went into Augustine and then Ibn Rushd, Al-Ghazali, and your different monotheistic philosophers. But we're looking at it, we looked at it through an autobiography with Augustine's Confessions. So if you really want to sort of get into a debate with Augustine, you have to read some of his other works. This was simply his autobiography showing you how he reached it. It was not meant to, it wasn't meant as a polemic against anything. But he wrote many, many other works. So if you wish to debate with Augustine, you must go well beyond what you're reading in this particular course. We introduce you to the human in this kind of course. We introduce you primarily to the human action, the human spirit as it's developing, as it's going in different directions, how it develops things, what it faces as challenges, how it tries to come over these challenges. That's the story of CVSP, supposedly from Epic of Gilgamesh to Stephen Hawking, to 1, to 2, to 3, to 4. Now you take snippets here and there, so the lecturer has to figure out how to do justice to what he's trying to do and trying to give you the basic things you need to know. You haven't had the fullness of 201, you've had so you should be able to follow basically what's happening. Now this time, all of the Greek philosophical world and the Greek understanding of things, and now in this notion, now we're focusing on love, eros, Philadelphia. There are many terms for love. The Christians chose to use the word agape, because it wasn't much used, and so they gave the word its content in this. Taught you how to do that very well. What the monotheistic claims to do is that it adds to you the free love and mercy and compassion and all that stuff that comes from the Abrahamic God. So the whole story of the work, well, first of all, just to finish this slide, so God's love, when experienced, purifies the human being and gives eros its right spirit, humility, protecting against pride, humilitas, and superbia were the terms for that Augustine had when he was with the Platonists and the Platonist form of mysticism and all of this. He left them not just because he disagreed finally with what they were doing, but he felt that they were proud. And he could only see the true divinity that was seeking in humilitas, in humility. Pride was superbia. So this is not a new story, in other words. It's not a fulfillment, the development of a long story, where Dante now tries to put into a great poem, an epic poem, 3 parts, hell, heaven, all right? The full, as much as can be presented in such a way. So Christian thought, the maturity of Christian thought that has reached this point is now being presented to us not through Aquinas' philosophy or anybody else's philosophy, but rather in this great epic poem. So he's kind of like a Virgil for the Romans. He's like a Homer for the Greeks. He's kind of presenting himself in a certain way like that for the Christian world of this period. So the second thing about Eros is it gives us its right perspective, clarifying the true value and hierarchy of goods. Example, authentic love is superior to intellectual prowess. So the philosopher thinks it's a question finally of intellectual contemplation, is missing the point that love gives intellectual contemplation its true spirit. It fulfills it. And on the other hand, a simple human being can experience and respond to this love in a much fuller way through their will, because you've had Augustine. It's the will, not the reason, that's going to make you a greater human or a lesser human. It's not your philosophy, your mystical experience, your whatever else that you might have. All that needs to be purified and led to its highest form through authentic love. What is authentic love? Well, we'll talk about that when we come back to the 7th slide and talk about how he presents authentic love from how to distinguish it from inauthentic love. Authentic love can be experienced by any simple human being. That's why the immortality of the soul only in Aristotle only for the rational soul of the philosopher makes sense. You see, it's a good conclusion of the way he's thinking. Now they're claiming that there's revelation, and God has now shown that that's not the way to really reach the fulfillment of humanity. It's the will. It's using your will as your love, remember, with Augustine. And the way you use your love will make of you a great human or a lesser human, and not anything else. So let me go back then to this. So Caritas summarizes the project of human life. It's a concrete way of living and relating. It's not just a search for purely self-centered actualization and satisfaction. It's on the contrary, it's sacrifice, it's giving. It's being a Prometheus, being an Oedipus, being a Plato's philosopher, choosing to come back down to the cave. It's that image. It's an Abraham. It's a it's a way of life. It's not just a way of relating. It's not just an experience, and it's not just developing a human mind. It's the way you live. So Caritas comprises the optimal balance of all human capacities. All your intellectual, your artistic, your socio-political, all the human capacities you have are in themselves very good, but they will not reach their fulfillment, and in fact they could be a challenge to the best unless you really coat them with, if you like, this kind of spirit, this new spirit. Because if you don't know this, but because you've had this whole Christian world, you don't know about that. The Christians believe that the Hebrews were expecting the promised land. When Christ comes, the promise becomes the promised spirit. The Holy Spirit of creation is now going to be given to humanity to another creation, in a sense. The first creation through God's Spirit, and with God's Spirit now there's a new human being coming up there. And this human being can only be achieved with this spirit, with this the spirit of love. Is the only thing that can really fulfill your intellect, your artistic, your socio-political, whatever other gifts you happen to have. And this is now going to be presented in this great epic work through two figures, Virgil and Beatrice. Virgil, the Homer for the Romans, he wrote the Aeneid. He represents all the best that human mind and effort and thought and creativity, everything that a human being could possibly achieve. So he's the model, the perfect human in a rationalistic world. Beatrice represents now the perfect human in an Abrahamic monotheistic Christian world. These two characters, and we'll talk more about them in a little while, but that's what in this work, which is highly symbolic, Dante's Divine Comedy, the focus is on these two characters, Virgil, who will represent all of the Greco-Roman intellectual tradition, and Beatrice, who will represent all of the Abrahamic monotheistic tradition. And they will, the relationship between them for Christian thought will be presented to you through characters, through this great epic poem. And you see, I want to start with these because there's such shortage of time on at least, and they're on your web, on your thing. They're on the web. The whole thing is on the web, but they're also on these slides back here. But I want to give you the stuff you can focus on and then come back and try to see how much time I have to help you about the poem itself and the characters in it. But to relate to what's been happening before, the Greek world and the monotheistic world, this is now, and you know, the people who tried to bring them together, the Ibn Rushds and the Aquinas. We didn't have Maimonides to get the Hebrew in also. They all flowed into Aquinas' work, that bringing together all of this into a philosophy that's presented, or a theology or a philosophy presented through a poem. Basically, the natural virtues were given by Plato. So you've done the Republic. In the Republic, he says at one point, the full complement of goodness is in justice, wisdom, courage, and self-control, self-mastery. All right, so justice, wisdom, courage, self-mastery. These are the four great virtues, the natural virtues that all philosophers were seeking, monotheistic as well as non-monotheistic. All right, this is the Greek tradition, in other words. And so goodness is the fulfillment of all four of these things. You can't have justice if you don't see it's good. It's a form of goodness. You won't understand wisdom unless you understand it's a form of goodness. You can't understand what courage is unless you see it's a form of goodness. You can't understand what self-mastery is unless you see it's a form of goodness. They're not just things to do to make you feel great and all this goodness. And he tells you what goodness is in his cave story. Goodness is the philosopher who comes back down into the cave and gives his life to the Socrates, who gives his life to that. So there's much more in Plato's story than just the cliches we sometimes wind up with, and then that's not your fault. It's because you need to go into these. That's why CVSP is only trying to give you a taste of these people, so you can go in and then you can reject everything you've been told in CVSP. It's meant to sort of, inspire you to go and look more into Plato than you just had in the whatever you had there, and now to look more into the whole of this Christian monotheistic world than just whatever you've had up to here. The human excellence now, therefore, what do we live for? What's the meaning of life? All right, meaning of life for Plato was seeking goodness and bringing in the good life, because Socrates had brought philosophy down from cosmology to seeking the good life, okay? Now, okay, having all of that, all the Plato and standing on the shoulders of these great giants, in other words, Christian philosophy, through people like Augustine and Aquinas and others, standing on the shoulders of these boys, not denying them, not saying they're wrong or anything like that. So these were philosophers in the Greek tradition, the ones I'm talking about. They saw now that in their faith experience in the Christian world, they had experienced three other virtues. They became aware of three virtues which were not included in that goodness thing. Faith, hope, and love. Faith, hope, and charity. Sometimes it used to be called, now it's called love, because caritas was translated into English as charity. But charity now means giving money to your poor CVSP teachers. But charity, caritas, means, really the fullness of all of your love with the spirit of God's love, and then you're acting out, your image and likeness of God. You're acting out your true reality in the way you live it out, not just in your thought pattern. So, faith is access to full wisdom. So, faith is not a jump in a leap in the void, or a blind faith or anything like this. That's nice for people who have some other philosophy and they want to prove it in a simplistic way. But faith for the serious monotheist means the response to experience, the response to the experience of God, not adhering to a dogma. That comes later. You then take a look at the dogmas and see if those dogmas fit your experience of this God, and then that's why the people accept it, because they find that the way it's put into doctrines and dogmas, and once you understand what they meant, is a good reflection of their ongoing experience of this God. Abraham was experiencing God and responding to that God. So don't ever forget that about the Abraham icon, no matter how well it's abused in other ways. In this way, that's the heart of the Abrahamic story in the Hebrew Scriptures, and why he becomes like Socrates for philosophy, like Prometheus for tragedy, why Abraham becomes an icon for monotheism, because it's the response. Faith is a good spirit. When you're given something, you should respond to it in a good way. When you're given something, you just take it for yourself, and you don't want to give back.
This is the opposite of faith. This is Adam and Eve getting everything supposedly, but wanting to take it all for themselves, not wanting to give it back to God. We'll be our own gods, all right? So that's symbolism, very great symbolism there that continues to, if you follow it, shed light on much of what happens after that in thought. Faith then gives you the experience of God, and remember, experience gives you understanding. Remember what Augustine had said. There are certain things you can never understand if you don't experience them. All right, so experiencing God, you now understand more of what this God is. You get more wisdom. You get a wisdom that you never can get just from, in the intellectual or the mystical process. You're getting, a direct package of knowledge. So faith gives you access to the fullness of wisdom. Wisdom with not just as a form of goodness, but wisdom as a form of God's love. Hope. Hope now comes directly out of faith. It's the proper deduction of true faith. It's not optimism. Optimism is just a personality trait. Hope now is assurance. Assurance that what you are experiencing now, and you have a good mind, and you know how to draw proper deductions from it, you draw the proper deduction. You have hope. And so the future is, of course, that's what gives hope. See, when God promises Noah, he'll never do anything like this again. Well, the whole chapters there are telling you how trustworthy this God is. So that promise gives hope that, that you can live in a world that whatever happens, there is a God there, and no matter how cruel humans become, there's always another factor of hope for the future. If you compare it with the Gilgamesh story that you've had in 201, all right, who promises anything at the end of the flood story? All right, because you see the Hebrew flood story was kind of an answer or a dialogue with the earlier Mesopotamian one, which of course all the Hebrews had heard, and then trying to teach them that this is not the truth about what God does. So if you remember in the flood story, the flood comes because the gods can't sleep. You never have a good reason. Humans survive because Utnapishtim has a wasta with one of the gods who betrays all the gods because he goes against their decision. And then Ishtar, who in the Gilgamesh world is is not a model of anything. She gets all crazy and hectic because Gilgamesh doesn't want to marry her, even though he gives her the good reasons why he doesn't want to marry her. So the whole notion there is a very different package for hope. Ishtar is the one who gives a sort of a promise at the end of the Gilgamesh work. So when you get the Hebrew scriptures, that's what they're trying to tell you. They're not giving you, word by word truth that you should memorize or something like that. They're giving you an answer of how to understand what you've been taught in the Mesopotamian and the Egyptian world. Love, therefore, is the only motivation so faith gives you access to full wisdom. Hope gives you motivation for courage. Courage isn't just to show how strong you are and how great you are, but now courage has a purpose. Courage has a purpose of love. Within every single one of these things, when you have courage, it's to do a loving thing. It's not just have courage to show how great you are. All right, it's to have the right kind of courage, where you have courage in order to do something good for yourself and good for humanity. The two things of Apollo: seek truth, always know, and then whatever you get to be true, do the best for the polis. Love is the caritas, and this Aquinas had said this, and all of this, much of this comes from Aquinas. He's now sort of putting it into the poem. That without this kind of love, there would be no real motivation. Why shouldn't I commit adultery? All right. She loves me, I love her. Well, the husband, or, another package there. What about the husband? I'm supposed to love everybody, okay? Is this loving the husband? So adultery starts to make sense, all right? It's the person behind what's happening, not the sin itself. Adultery, you could justify it in many different ways, and that'd be nice, but you can't justify it in terms of you are supposed to be the image and likeness of God, and therefore you care for every human being equally, and therefore you care for the husband like the wife. And so all of the 10 Commandments, supposedly, therefore, are all forms of showing your love. the negative form, the worst case situation, killing. Yeah, but killing means taking that person's life. Loving that person properly means giving them life. So doing everything you can to give them more and more and more and more life. Okay, don't commit adultery. Well, it's to help these couples to be more and more faithful and sort of develop each other in the best possible way. Stealing. Well, you are stealing from a poor person if they steal from you because they can't live otherwise. You're the thief, not the one if they're stealing to survive. And you could have helped them, but you don't. You're the one who's breaking that commandment. So this is what the Christians understand happened with the coming of the Messiah. With the coming of Jesus, he helps them all to take a look at what was in the Hebrew Scriptures, but it wasn't understood fully. Now we're looking at a philosophical understanding. The philosophical and theological understanding that comes out of it is this kind of thing. What is human excellence? What is human fulfillment? What's the best life? What's the good life? A life that is seeking goodness through justice and wisdom and courage and self-mastery, but also seeking the relationship with God, the response to the invitation of God to come into a relationship with him, whereby you experience his love, his Holy Spirit, the love of God, and that therefore your life can become truly complete if you bring together the great Greco-Roman tradition and the great Abrahamic monotheistic tradition into the Christian world. That's what this particular work is trying to do. Let me now try to go to the beginning and just give you some basic things. This was just a way of getting your attention at the beginning of the course, but you don't. I didn't realize that that you could ride a cow. You know, I ride horses. I love riding horses, but I have never tried to ride a cow. Well, this is a publicity break. Okay. The lion one was more interesting because it was a form of love. These are some of the people that you're looking at in 205. Some of them in 202, I think we look at more than what you look at here. That's not important. Where we are now, we're in Florence, okay? And Florence was a place of great learning and great art and great political power and ambition at this time. And there were great wars happening between these boys and these boys, between the popes and the emperors. And of course, it's always packaged into this simplified thing of, it's religion against everybody else. Well, the story of Christianity starts with the emperors persecuting Christianity, and then with Constantine they start to accept that Christians weren't outlaws, and then with Theodosius later on, it became the official religion of the state. Emperors still either persecuted Christians or tried to interfere with their religious and theological affairs. That's the beginning of the story. The beginning of the aggression came from the secular, from the emperor, from the others. The response started to develop, first in a good way, and then it became a pure question of power. All right? By the time now of this world, you have two centers of power in Europe. All right? You have the Vatican and you have the popes, and you have the Holy Roman emperors, the emperors. And so basically at this particular time, the Emperor Barbarossa, that's an example of what he was actually ruling at that time. The Roman Empire sometimes included more than that. And this was Italy in the 12th century. But the sword and the crook. And in the middle chapters 16, 17, and 18 of the Purgatorio, the book you have, those are the key chapters where he brings together everything he's doing in the whole work, from the beginning of Inferno with 33 cantos, and then the 33 cantos of Purgatorio, and then the 33 cantos, or whatever they are, altogether of that. The middle part, that's why in a short time, one way of thrusting you into the theological and philosophical and human meaning of this work, cantos 16, 17, and 18 of the Purgatorio are the heart of the matter, where many of the things that I have mentioned already would be referred to. But the background, the socioeconomic, political, existential background of all this was the ongoing fight for power, the lust for power that Thucydides had focused on. You don't do that in 205, but that was that spurred Plato on to many things, and he tried to tell you that we're not just victims of the lust for power. We can overcome it with reason, but it's a very, very different challenge. But the lust for power, from Adam and Eve to Dante, the lust for power has been very attractive. And so the lust for power hits every human. It doesn't just hit religious people. It doesn't just hit non-religious people. It doesn't hit, it hits humans. So the lust for power was really, having a heyday in Europe for these centuries. So the balance would go between the emperors and between the popes, between the emperors and between the popes. And Dante says, when he's in these cantos 16, 17, and 18, find it for yourself, when Dante asks Virgil, what's the reason for so much misery in this world? Why is there so much misery in this world? And his response is to the point, a political answer, not the spiritual answer here. The spiritual answer comes through love and all that. But he says it's because the sword and the crook are fighting each other, the meaning of it there. The crook is the religious aspect. Religious leaders in the whole religious world should be working to give themselves to help humanity develop in the best possible way, making the best use of all the spiritual heritage they have. All right? And helping them to live it. The crook, that's the crook. The sword, of course, is the political thing. And, you need to have a sword. You need to have the political world. You need to have the temporal world. You can't live without it. Now, his basic point, and it's on your fly sheets, by the way, as not the slides, but back the last one there. Read it later. The harmonious union of faith, of the spiritual and the temporal. The spiritual should mind its own proper business. The political should mind its own proper business. Insofar as they do so, you get a good result. When they don't do so, they're going against human nature. All right? And they are therefore inevitably going to cause great misery for whatever society they're doing. When the religious people hold back science, because they believe the law of gravity would go against God, or because the law of evolution would go against the Bible, all right? Well, fortunately, in the biblical world, there were very important theological people who immediately wrote to Darwin and said, this is because they understood what the Bible was. He said, if we are now understanding better how God created the world, this is wonderful, all right? But, of course, to get this through to people takes time, because people, not everybody can understand the development of things that require specialization. So when they persecute the scientists and Galileo and things like that, they're obviously not doing the Abrahamic thing. They're not doing the loving thing. They're not doing their proper business for what Plato says is justice. They're not doing what is their best proper business. They're just doing the power thing. They want to keep power. Now, there may be some good things to it. They want to keep the unity of the people because the people will be disturbed. They won't understand. But they can do it in a better way than some of the stupid ways that they chose to do throughout history. That's the problem of the religious authorities, the spiritual, supposedly. So as purifying the spiritual, reforming the spiritual, that's the task of the spiritual. The more that's reformed, the more that is purified, the more it will give the good stuff it's supposed to give to all of humanity. The sword. The more the sword does what the politicians are supposed to do, using the reason, using experience, using political savvy, using the best they have, their resources, the more you'll get good things for humanity. When they conflict with one another, who suffers? All of humanity, including themselves. So it's not them and us. Humanity suffers when humans don't recognize what is their proper business, coming back to the Plato thing about justice in the Republic. That was justice. That was what Plato was trying to tell us. Let a human being discover what they can do best and then try to do that and to solve that, not just to do what they can get through power. So this battle between the emperors and the popes brought great misery to people at this time. And Dante was, in his work, continuing what Aquinas had said, what an Ibn Rushd had tried to do and others in Islam, what Augustine had tried to do much sooner. Separate the two things you're studying. Each thing has its own path, its own way of understanding it. Religion and spirituality is experience. You need to get in there and get your feet wet. You need to, it's a much more difficult one. The other one is clearer because so each one do their thing in the way they're supposed to do it. So, this is the context. Virgil is the main character, the one who leads Dante. So there are three characters. Let's stop at this point. Dante is the author, but he's also the main figure. And the whole work starts with a passage from the Inferno, where he is attacked by three beasts, and lion, leopard, and she-wolf. And they represent the three worst forms of love, all right? Pride, envy, and wrath. So he's telling you, I had reached a point in my life, he says, midway in my life, with all the great things he had achieved and all that, but all the problems he had, he found himself a slave to pride, envy, and wrath. And this turns out to be, if you remember the slide on 7, which you have here, this is the worst thing that your natural love can reach. When your natural love reaches pride, everybody serves you, you own everybody, all right? Envy, you can't bear somebody else getting something better than you. You have no love for that person. You don't have no admiration. It's nice if that somebody is better than you. It's good if this person can do that. No, envy. As soon as somebody, the crabs, as they come out of the bucket, crabs coming out of a bucket, somebody's coming, one of the crabs is going to leave, all the other crabs always pull the crab back down. So this is the crab syndrome of envy, all right? Wrath, شو ما في عشاء, شو ما في delivery, أنا كلمتي ما بصير اثنين, wrath, this is not wrath, this is not, so God's wrath is justice, all right? God's jealousy is the concern for the human not to destroy themselves, all right? So these things, and God's pride is anything but pride, since he's ready to forgive and not exterminate humanity just because they're disturbing him, but to continue to give, to put up with things. The humility of the Oedipus, the humility of the philosopher comes back down into the cave. The humility, all these are reflections of what is meant by God's humility. And so pride, envy, and wrath are the wrong forms of love. Why does he choose Virgil then? Virgil represents now the best form of these 7, the best form of the goodness, wisdom, courage, all the things, all the moral things and the political things, all the wonderful things that have come from the Greco-Roman world are now symbolized in the character of Virgil. All right? That's the first one. Beatrice is the second one. Beatrice actually is all these things that have autobiographical elements in them, in other words. Beatrice was the first girl he fell in love with. He was something like 11, I think, and she was 8. And he fell in love with her and never lost that. This is the kind of the romantic and mystical love, when you fall in love with something like that in that way. All right? So Beatrice was there all the way through, and that's why he chooses Beatrice. Even though he never married her, he married somebody else, and etc. When he comes to choose the symbol, it's this mystical symbol that's stuck in his mind, this romantic symbol. So love, you see, can go in a romantic way, in a mystical way. That's the form that Beatrice takes in the mind of the author, Dante. But in fact, she married somebody else, he married somebody else. But everything, this was a form of kind of troubadour love, chivalry love. You fall in love with this girl, you write poetry to her, you don't think of sending her, you don't think of calling on the phone or asking her out for a date or approaching her in any way, but she becomes this highest form of eros and love of beauty and love of union with another person that's purely in your mind. That's who she is. So Virgil now is the guide. He's the tourist guide. He guides Dante through hell so that we can see how they understood what was hell. All right? Hell was the bad forms of love, and when you become a slave to them, they destroy you. That's hell already. It's not hell after life. Eternal life begins now, Jesus had said in the Hebrew Scriptures. All right? This is what they are trying to present. So just to take this slide, for instance, the love of sex, when it goes too far, and it's out of place, and it's the wrong person, and it becomes your God, you become a slave to that God, because every God other than this God, when you're a slave, that's what he says in this, when you're a slave to the true God, that's what makes you free. When you're not a slave to this true God, and you're not free, you can become a slave to all other gods. Polytheism isn't just the Greek and Roman and other forms. 5 minutes? Okay. So this is, sex, you become so obsessed with sex that you become its slave. You can't, you can't get over it. Part of this is what happened to Augustine, by the way, and he found that only God's Holy Spirit could get him out of this, and the grace that came from God that freed him from this obsessive love for sex that was holding him back from accepting monotheism in his day. So all the forms of hell, hell are the forms of love that have gone wrong and made a slave of you, either to any one of those 7 sins, the 7 sins that was on that thing there. So hell therefore has a whole atmosphere of despair, abandon hope. Those of you, if this is hell, there'd be a placard out there saying, abandon hope, all you enter here. So despair is the key notion of the spirit of what is hellish in life and what will be hellish forever, if there is a forever hell. And supposedly that's what humans are now creating. They're creating their hell and their heaven through what they're doing now. Well, if despair only reigns, then you have a hell. Now you have a hell and heaven together, right? If stagnation, there's no movement, there's no development. They just go around in circles, right? Absolute isolation. Every human is on their own. Right? When you get the absurdity in the 204 and Theatre of the Absurd and Waiting for Godot, nobody understands anybody, right? And absolute isolation of each one, each person. And so you have these 3 spiritual aspects right now of hellishness. Whatever causes despair, what causes you stagnation, what causes you to feel that you're absolutely open. There are hellish things happening. The heavenly things are the opposite. That's the virtues that you will then see. And if you go back to that 7 slide, since I probably won't have time for it, preparation for heaven. So in other words, the whole notion of purgatory, which is not a firm dogma in Christianity generally, only Catholics accept it as actually a true thing. But what is it? Everybody believes in all of the monotheistic religions that the human being to enter heaven has to be purified, because heaven supposedly is something free of all evil. So if you're still who you are at death and you enter heaven, something has to happen to you between that point of your death and the point of entering heaven. Heaven meaning, the city of heaven, as Augustine calls it, a whole new humanity. You're going to spoil it again if you're not purged. So purgatory simply means that you need to be purged. And in Christianity, it's the spiritual warfare right now, where you fight your sinfulness and you practice and habituate more your virtues. In Islam, there's the higher jihad and the lesser jihad. The lesser jihad is the holy war. The higher jihad, the more important jihad, is exactly the jihad against these passions that destroy you and enslave you, so you cannot be heavenly. So philosophically, theologically, poetically, it symbolizes the need for that. And therefore it can happen on this, it could be a picture of what's happening on this earth. So if you want to take hell and heaven out, purgatory is Dante's symbol of what is happening right now on this earth, that you are being purged and you are creating your own hell or your own heaven. And you're not just creating it for yourself, but you're creating it for the whole human community. Hell, of course, heaven is when you've reached the fullness of bliss. Mish shari'a bliss, bas wala iblis, bas bliss, okay? أول شيء لما كان هون في شارع bliss اعترضوا شو عم بتسموا شارع اسمه bliss. Anyway, so this is a long time ago. But bliss is the fullness of fulfillment and happiness. Total fulfillment, perfect communion with each other. Not the union of melting into one another in a mystical union. That's another path. All right? Here it's where you're still who you are, but you are perfectly who you are, and perfectly relating to one another who you are. This is paradise lost, and this is heaven now regained in this Christian picture of the human journey. In the middle of your books, you have this table. On the one side, you have the bad loves. On the other side, you have the virtues, the opposite of them. So you have the list there, which I have put on the slide anyway. So allegorical interpretation, I'm not going to have any time to do anything of this. But why Dante? Because of his ongoing influence, seen even that in the movie world you have 7. He wrote in the vernacular. He didn't write in the Latin so that people could read his work. And this was one of the people who started Europe to start to write in their own languages so more people could have communicated to them that which only the scholars could get in Latin. Medieval synthesis. This is an excellent example of how a synthesis can happen. So when you're thinking of what would you want to reach as a synthesis today, you would have to think of what are the main things you'd have to incorporate into it. In its time, it was the Greco-Roman world and the Abrahamic monotheistic world, and how he brings the best of each of these, tries to bring the best of these together in this world. But very, very important politically was to continue this movement that had started before, but it never, Aquinas had said, when you mix the two, you get a monster, you get a right? When the church people influence with the political and the political with the church, you get a monster. Separate the two, do the best in each one, you get the best for everybody. Well, this is what Dante is presenting in this particular work. So when we talk today about separation of church and state, how important it is, especially when you have more people with more different cultures, you've got to you cannot just continue to have any one particular ruling for any one particular constitution or law for any state. You have to separate church from state. You have to separate religious and spiritual and ideological and philosophical belief, and that has its own way of dealing with it, from the political. The political has to deal with what everybody has in common, what can keep unity in so you know what is the political world. So he's a very important figure. Okay, and I've tried to give you some of these things, even though I haven't had time to deal with any of them. We used to have 2 full lectures to give all this. I've tried to give you the sheet where you could pursue some things if they make some meaning to you. But I'm over 5 minutes, right? He told me 5 minutes. I've been waiting for you all to say, hey. Well, okay, thank you for staying even beyond the